Brothers and sisters, is it possible for the state and the church to walk side by side in peace? Why is separation of church and state such a contentious issue that over the centuries has resulted in bloodshed and suffering? Was separation of church and state something that God willed, or was it an inevitable consequence of the fall of Adam and Eve and the subsequent reign of Satan on earth? Throughout the Old Testament, there was an uncomfortable shifting of power back and forth between religious and state rulers. In the Christian era, this continued, and at times when Europe was more open to God, things moved forward rather peacefully. In the last few hundred years, the rise of atheism and the wholesale rejection of God and religion has resulted in the sidelining of the church, and today there is a big push to get the church not only out of so-called state affairs, but out of everything. What has been happening in the US these last few years was a prime example of that. As an example, the current federal government tried a number of times and was continuing to push for the stripping of religious exemptions for Christian health institutions to be able to say no to abortions, gender reassignment surgery, and euthanasia on demand. This, I suspect, was one of the big reasons for the surprise outcomes of the recent election. The current government failed to win re-election because they sought not just a reasonable separation of church and state, but a wholesale submission of the church to the state. Let's now go back in time 100 years. Seeing the speed at which the world was hurtling towards atheism at the time, Pope Pius XI instituted the Feast of Christ the King in his encyclical Quas Primas of 1925. This institution was made in response to growing secularism and nationalism, and in the context of the unresolved Roman question. The Roman question was concerned with the Papal States, which were conquered by the Italian Republic, and the corresponding loss of temporal power of the Pope. Brothers and sisters, as it turns out, one of the longest ever continuous kingdoms, let's say, to reign in the history of humanity happens to be the Papal States, that went from around 753 AD to 1870 AD. So for over 1,000 years, the Pope was both the head of the Catholic Church and the temporal king, let's say, of a significant chunk of the Italian mainland. In the Papal States, there was no separation of church and state. Whether this was God's will or not is hard to say, but given that history has a habit of repeating itself, it is probably very likely that a future pope one day will again have a significant temporal leadership role. But what does this all have to do with the Feast of Christ the King, you may ask? Why did the church and the world need a new feast in the 20th century? Was the Pope just restating or highlighting what we always believed, or had a new need arisen? Had Europe forgotten who its true king was? To answer these questions, let's see what today's readings tell us of Jesus' kingship. In the first reading, Daniel has a vision of a man who is given sovereignty, glory, and kingship. And as Daniel says, men of all peoples, nations, and languages became his servants. This Son of Man, as he is called, we claim as Christians to be Jesus. So the Old Testament tells us of a future king whose sovereignty is eternal and whose empire will never be destroyed. In the second reading, the letter to the Hebrews claims Jesus is the ruler of the kings of the earth. That is, he is above the earthly kings, the King of Kings, as one of his titles claims. In the Alleluia verse, we say, "Blessed is he who inherits the kingdom of David, our father." Interestingly, King David was of the line of Judah and not Levi. That is, he was a temporal or state ruler, not a religious leader. Jesus, as a Davidic king, is a descendant of a line of state rulers, not the religious Levitical rulers. This suggests that Jesus was to be a state ruler. Finally, though, we come to the gospel of today. Jesus admits to Pilate that he is a king, but there is a twist. He states, "Mine is not a kingdom of this world." One might wonder if these very words are the basis for the constant battles between temporal leaders and the church. Is it upon these words that the world tells the church to stick its nose at her state affairs? Good question. But even if Jesus wanted nothing to do with temporal leadership, does that mean that the state can then strip the rights of the church? The rights to self-governance, the rights to the seal of the confessional, the rights to teach all of God's children the truths of the faith without retribution, the rights to protect all lives from the womb to the tomb. When Jesus said, "Mine is not a kingdom of this world," he didn't mean he had no authority over earthly kingdoms. Earthly kingdoms are in fact all subject to him, whether they like it or not. For as Jesus said at the end of Matthew's Gospel, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you." Brothers and sisters, we must continue to fight for our freedom to proclaim the gospel, to live according to our beliefs, and to promote a society that respects and promotes those same freedoms. For one day when Christ returns in all his glory, there will be no separation of church and state, and anything that is not in accordance with his eternal kingdom will in the end come to nothing.